Julian Prescott was always seen as the future of the country's most famous fashion house, but behind the expensive suit and the heavyweight last name was a man exhausted by being loved for his reflection in the window. That's why he vanished, trading luxury for an apron, becoming a delivery driver in a coastal town forgotten by time. And that's where he met Cora. But what started as a harmless lie soon became his greatest punishment, because this time the love was real. The town of Port Blossom seemed suspended in time on that stuffy November afternoon. The air smelled of salt, and the sound of the ocean mingled with the hum of sewing machines in Cora's makeshift studio. She was adjusting the straps on a cheap party dress when she heard a knock. A delivery driver, sweaty and out of breath, held a bag of takeout containers. He wasn't the usual guy. This one looked lost, tall, awkward, with a gaze too intense for someone just dropping off food. "Is this the order for a Mrs. Gable?" he asked with a smile that tried to mask his nerves. Cora nodded, taking the bag. "First time on this route?" she ventured. He nodded back. "And maybe the last. This town feels a little too small to hide in." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Hide from what?" Julian hesitated for a beat. Then, pointing to his own chest, he said, "From myself, I guess." Julian Prescott learned early on that his presence was worth more than his words. He grew up in corridors of glass and leather, surrounded by meetings, camera flashes, and parades of people who only smiled when there was something to be gained. At 28, he was the face of Prescott Couture, the nation's most influential luxury brand, and also the favorite target of the celebrity press. His name moved markets, but his soul, no one ever bothered to ask if it was okay. His mother, a seamstress before she married the fashion magnate, used to say that beauty lived in the details. It was with her that Julian learned to embroider silence on rainy afternoons, hidden away from the spotlight. But she died too soon, and he never found peace again. His father molded him for the world: appearance, control, results. Love was a scarce currency in those hallways. The breaking point came after an interview where his ex-fiancée revealed intimate details of Julian's life in exchange for a lucrative advertising deal. It was one more wound in the back of a man who no longer knew who to trust. Julian didn't argue. He didn't fight back. He simply vanished. He turned off his phone, transferred control of the company to his right-hand man, and hit the road with no destination in mind. He arrived in the coastal town by chance, a place with no flashy signs, where neighbors still greeted each other by name. He rented a simple room with a wooden bed and a noisy fan. He signed the lease as Jules and got a gig with a delivery app. For the first time, no one looked at him and tried to calculate his net worth. Here, he was just another lanky guy on a bike, struggling to pay his bills. But the relief was short-lived. A lie, no matter how small, has weight. And his began to feel heavy every time his eyes met Cora's. There was something about her that disarmed him. It wasn't her beauty or her directness. It was the silence she carried, like someone who had already trusted too much and had broken herself trying to fix others. He wanted to tell her everything, but how could he explain that even his name was a fabrication? That's where it all started to fall apart. Julian didn't know exactly what he was searching for when he left it all behind, but he knew what he couldn't stand anymore: being seen and, at the same time, being invisible. For as long as he could remember, people had treated him like a concept, the heir, the face of the brand, the perfect man on display in store windows. Even his vulnerabilities seemed crafted for a marketing campaign. He was admired by people who didn't know him, and discarded by those who claimed to love him. He wanted something money couldn't buy, something that wasn't for sale, not in a storefront or in the fine print of a contract. He wanted to be loved for who he was when the world stopped watching. This desire wasn't born in a single moment, but had built up over years of small betrayals, opportunistic friendships, and relationships that began with expensive dinners and ended with false headlines. The final straw was what his ex-fiancée revealed on national TV, that he cried listening to old vinyl records and wrote letters he never sent. She laughed as she told the story, as if it were a weakness. But for Julian, that was all he had left that was real. When he got to the town, the first thing he did was walk barefoot in the sand. The simple ground reminded him of his childhood, when his mother would take him to her workshop and let him pick out the colorful buttons. She used to say that the small details revealed more about a person than what they said out loud. In his first days as a delivery driver, Julian felt a strange kind of freedom. No one knew his last name. No one took his picture. The tips were small, but the thank yous were genuine, and for him that was a revolution in itself. But it was only when he met Cora that everything inside him truly began to shift. She wasn't what he expected. She didn't try to please him or make an effort to be friendly. She worked far more than she should, slept less than she needed, and had a way of looking at people as if she no longer expected anything from them. At first, Julian thought it was coldness. Later he understood. It was a shield. Cora's hands were marked by needles and thread. Her fingers were always covered in tiny cuts. Yet she sewed with a delicacy that seemed impossible. There was something poetic in the way she turned cheap fabric into something beautiful, as if she were trying to say, without words, that everything, even what's been discarded, deserves a second chance. Julian started making up excuses to deliver on her street. Sometimes it wasn't even the right address, but he'd show up with a bag and a shy smile. She noticed, of course, but she pretended not to. One afternoon, seeing her closing up the studio, he remarked, "You look tired," she answered without looking at him. "I'm just tired of trusting people who are too good at lying." That line echoed in his head for days. He knew he was treading on fragile ground. Cora had been hurt before, and it wouldn't be fair to put her through that again. But how could he explain that he wasn't just who she saw, and at the same time, he was no longer who he used to be? That night, he went back to his room and wrote for the first time in years. Not a love letter, not an explanation, just an outpouring. "I want to be seen without a filter," he wrote. "I want to be loved for who I am when no one is around." He wanted this with everything he had. It wasn't just about romance. It was about dignity, about finding in the chaos of his own story someone who would hold his hand and say, "You can stop pretending now." But the fear was also growing. What if, when he revealed who he really was, she pulled away? What if his truth came too late? That night, he walked to the beach, the dark, calm sea in front of him. He tossed his shoes onto the sand and just stood there, staring at the horizon as if waiting for an answer. He didn't find one. But he understood that deep down, what he wanted most was to no longer have to hide. At first, Julian thought he could control it, that all he had to do was keep the story simple. Fake name, normal job, a quiet routine. He wasn't hurting anyone after all. He was just trying to live like a normal person. But the problem was, Cora wasn't just anyone. With every conversation, she seemed to peel back layers he swore he had buried. She didn't ask about brand names or expensive tastes, but about memories. What he was afraid of as a child, what made him smile for no reason, things no one else ever asked, and somehow he would answer. Not with outright lies, but with half-truths. He'd say his mother used to sew, that he grew up surrounded by fabrics and the sound of machines, but he'd leave out the part about the crystal chandeliers in the 4-story studio downtown. He'd admit he left everything behind after a bad breakup, but wouldn't explain that everything included a fortune with 5 more zeros than anyone in Port Blossom could ever imagine. Their conversations deepened without warning. She told him about her absent father, about her mother who had a breakdown after losing everything, about the time she spent selling thrift store clothes to make rent, and she spoke of these things without a trace of victimhood, almost with a kind of quiet pride, like someone who had survived a shipwreck and still had the strength to build a raft from the wreckage. Julian listened, and the knot in his stomach only tightened. How could she trust so easily after being so hurt? How could he hide so much after being so welcomed. The dilemma grew in silence. Sometimes he tried to speak up. He'd start to form sentences like, "I need to tell you something," or "I'm not exactly who you think I am." But he was always cut off. A customer arriving, a change of subject, a comment from her about how much she hated people who could lie so calmly. And those comments cut him deeper than any tailor's shears. One night, Cora mentioned her ex, a visual artist who always said he wanted a simple life. She had worked double shifts for months to support them both, only to find out later he was the son of an influential politician. When she asked why he never told her, he replied, "Because I wanted to know if you would stay with me, even without knowing." Cora was silent for days. Then she packed her bags, left without a word, and never answered his calls again. "A lie for protection is still a lie," she told Julian that night, completely unaware of how close to home she was hitting. He gave a weak laugh and replied with one of the phrases he hated most, "I get it." But he didn't, or maybe he understood all too well. What Julian wanted most was for Cora to truly see him. But what he feared most was that once seen, he would be rejected. Not for being poor. He knew she respected that, but for pretending, for thinking he could build something real on a foundation of lies. That week, Cora gave him a gift, a small, hand-embroidered patch of fabric, a tree with long roots and broken branches. "To remind you where you come from," she said, smiling. And Julian nearly fell apart right there, because what she didn't know was that he had no idea where he truly came from. His public version was a mask, his private one an attempt. And standing there, with that embroidered piece of cloth in his hands, he felt for the first time that he was truly falling in love. Not like before, not with promises and fancy dinners, but with an exposed, wounded heart, longing for rest. But along with love, the fear grew. The fear of losing something that wasn't even his yet. The fear of being just one more person on the list of those who made Cora believe and then vanished. The lie that had seemed so harmless at first now had a voice and a face and deep brown eyes that every time they looked at him made him wonder, will she still look at me this way when she knows who I really am? The idea was simple. A charity event to raise funds to renovate the town's orphanage. Cora organized it all herself. She sewed costumes for the children, set up a small craft fair with the locals, and even improvised a runway out of colorful fabrics where the kids could show off their own handmade clothes. The whole town pitched in, but it was clear. The glow came from her. Julian offered to help set up the tents. He arrived early, carried boxes, swept the grounds. He knew he couldn't fix the past, but he could at least be present in that moment. Cora didn't say it, but he could tell this event meant something to her, maybe a kind of rebirth. The late afternoon arrived with a rust-colored sky and a light breeze. People began to show up. Kids gathered around the dessert table. Cora, in a simple white dress with a scarf in her hair, seemed to float between smiles and shy hugs. Julian watched her from a distance, as if the entire world were in slow motion. That's when it all came crashing down. He was helping an elderly woman adjust a sign when he heard a voice behind him, laughing, mocking, completely out of place with the feel of the event. "Well, look what we have here. If it isn't Julian Prescott, the missing person of the year." Julian froze. He turned slowly. A tall man, artificially tanned, wearing a loud print shirt and sunglasses at sunset, was grinning like he knew more than he should. "Trevor?" Julian whispered, breathless. "The one and only, buddy." Trevor threw his arms open. "Dude, I looked for you for months. I thought you'd been abducted by aliens. And now I find you here, in flip-flops, setting up a tent. What is this? Some kind of air detox?" Julian tried to cut him off. "This isn't the time or place. What are you talking about, man?" Trevor laughed. "This is gold. People are going to lose their minds." And without a second thought, he pulled out his phone. "Hey everyone, check out who I just found. Julian Prescott, the prince of high fashion, now serving coconut water in a fishing village. Genius." The live stream was on, and within seconds, heads started to turn. First discreetly, then insistently. Murmurs began to rise like waves, until finally Cora appeared from behind one of the tents, drawn by the commotion. She stopped. Her eyes scanned the scene slowly until they landed on Julian's face. He tried to speak, but she was already putting the pieces together. Julian. The name left her lips as both a question and a verdict. He swallowed hard. He walked toward her. Cora, let me explain. Explain what? Her voice was low but steady. That the delivery guy who just happened to show up every day was just a bored heir playing dress-up as a normal person? That's not what it was. I swear. At first, yes, I was running away. But then it was about you. It was about me? She laughed, a bitter sound. Then why did you never tell me? Trevor tried to intervene, still holding his phone. Whoa, guys, calm down. I didn't even know he was hiding. I just thought it was funny. I didn't mean to. Cora ignored him. I told you everything, Julian. Everything. I opened up. I trusted you. I told you about my past. About what I went through with people who lie to seem simpler than they are. And you did the exact same thing. I fell in love with you. That wasn't a lie. She took a step back. But you were. A heavy silence fell. The people around them weren't pretending anymore. Some were whispering, others stared with disappointment. This was a small town. Loyalty was a serious thing here, and nobody liked feeling like they'd been made a fool of, especially by someone who could buy the whole street with a snap of his fingers. Julian saw Cora's eyes well up with tears. Not the kind that fall, the kind that stay dammed up, defiant, like a wall about to break. But she didn't cry. Not there. Get out of my way, she said. Just go. He hesitated, then obeyed. He moved aside. She walked past him without a single glance back. Trevor's live stream was still running. Turn that off, Julian whispered. Dude, I'm sorry. I thought it would be funny. Julian grabbed the phone and ended the stream with a firm tap, then handed it back. He didn't say another word. He didn't have to. Cora disappeared among the tents. He didn't see her again that night. He remained there, frozen, as the sky grew dark and the fair lights blinked on one by one. The children had their fashion show. The adults carried on, feigning normality. But the glow was gone. The truth, when it arrives late, hurts more than the lie. And that night, Julian understood the true weight of his omission. It wasn't about what he hid. It was about what she revealed, and his failure to match her courage with his own. When he finally left, the ground felt unsteady beneath his feet. The faces around him more distant. The place where he thought he'd found peace now echoed with a single feeling: shame. Cora didn't go home that night. Not because she had nowhere to go, but because she couldn't bear to be surrounded by walls that held memories of him. She walked along the beach to the foot of the abandoned pier, sat on the damp sand, and just let time pass. She didn't cry, not yet. She was numb, as if it had all happened to someone else. A version of herself who once again had believed, once again had fallen. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the exact moment she began to trust him. Maybe it was when he offered to help her paint the sign for her studio, or when he showed up with ice cream on a day when everything seemed to be going wrong. Or maybe it was when, without knowing, he recited a phrase identical to one her mother used to say: "Things made by hand carry more than just stitches, they carry a soul." That's what hurt. He knew how to say all the right words, but he didn't have the courage to be the right person. Cora returned home as the sky was beginning to lighten. She didn't turn on a lamp. She moved through the darkness, guided only by the familiar shapes of her furniture. She opened a closet, pulled out a wooden box where she kept her oldest fabrics, and took one out, a piece of raw linen her mother had brought from the countryside years ago. It was special. It had never been used. She spread the fabric on her table and began to sketch. Not a dress, but some kind of cape, with no clear purpose, no obvious function. She just needed to sew. She needed to transform pain into thread, anger into a stitch, loneliness into a weave. On the other side of town, Julian sat in his rented room, the same one he'd arrived in months before, with the illusion that he could start over. Now the room felt smaller, suffocating. The walls seemed to echo her name. He tried to sleep, but the silence was a cruel judge. He opened his laptop for the first time in weeks. 17 unread emails from his team, messages from his father, his lawyer, the board, all of them wanting to know where he was, when he was coming back, if he was safe. He was, but he wasn't whole. The next morning, Julian left his room early. He walked to the little cafe where he used to buy cheap pastries and weak coffee. The woman behind the counter, who always smiled, just gave him a curt nod. She didn't say good morning. She didn't ask how he was. News travels fast in small towns, and Cora was too beloved for anyone to take his side. He spent the rest of the day wandering the streets, aimless. He stopped in front of her closed studio. The back in 15 minutes sign hung crookedly on the door, but he knew it was a lie. She wouldn't be back any time soon. He pulled the embroidered patch she had given him from his pocket. He ran his fingers over the stitched roots and felt a tightness in his chest. The tree seemed more alive than he was. He went back to his room and started to write. He wanted to explain everything, tell her about his childhood, the suffocation of being who he was. Tell her that, for the first time, he had felt real, but as he reread the words, they all sounded like excuses. And making excuses was just a polite way of running from guilt. He deleted it all, rewrote it, then tore it up. In the days that followed, he tried everything. He sent texts, no reply. He left notes, all ignored. He waited for hours in front of her studio. Nothing. On the third day, he saw Cora leave her house carrying a box. She crossed the street without looking either way. He almost called out to her, but he didn't. He knew that if she turned her eyes and saw him, like that, he wouldn't be able to bear it. The town began to treat him like a shadow. Where there was once friendliness, there was now distance. The greetings vanished. Conversations would die down when he walked by. The town was too small for make-believe, and overly rich people, even in disguise, always left a trail. Mrs. Gable, who always used to offer him cornbread in the afternoon, now just left a plate on his doorstep. No note, no smile. Just the food, lukewarm and silent. Julian spent the night on the pier, the same spot where Cora had sat. He stayed there, feet dangling over the edge, trying to understand how someone could get so lost while trying to be found. The next morning, he made his decision. He packed his bags, paid for the room. He gave a brief nod of thanks and walked to the bus stop, head down, shoulders slumped. He didn't draw attention. He didn't say goodbye. The ride back to the city was silent. The big city swallowed him without asking any questions. No one there cared that he'd been gone, because, in a way, he had never truly been there at all. Arriving at his apartment, he sat on the balcony and stared at the view. The building seemed to have grown even taller than he remembered. Everything was immense, but inside him, everything felt so small. He opened his closet. He saw the tailored suits, the polished shoes, the expensive colognes. He touched each item as if it belonged to a stranger. After pretending to be someone else for so long, he no longer knew who he was, and for the first time, that terrified him. Have you ever trusted someone who seemed so sincere, only to find out it was all a well-crafted mask? If that's ever happened to you, comment, "I've felt that, just so I know you're here." For real. Sometimes, the pain of being deceived isn't about the lie itself, but about the time we spent believing that, finally, it was safe to love. Cora was in her backyard when the letter arrived. There was no fancy letterhead, no return address, just a folded piece of paper with her name written on it by hand. The paper had creases from being folded and refolded, as if someone had written it, hesitated, put it away, and reopened it many times before finally delivering it. It was Mrs. Gable who found the envelope on the doorstep early that morning. She said she didn't see anyone. She just thought Cora ought to read it. Cora didn't open it right away. She spent the day with the letter in her apron pocket, feeling its weight like an uncomfortable reminder. She didn't know if she wanted to face more of Julian's words, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away either. When the sun began to dip behind the rooftops, she lit the lantern in her studio and for the first time in days sat in her mother's old rocking chair. She took a deep breath and opened the paper. It wasn't a justification, nor was it an elaborate apology. It was a confession. Cora, I don't know if you'll read this. Maybe you loved the version you thought I was more than who I really am. And that's okay. I'm writing this because I have to, because I don't know if I have the right to speak to you anymore, but I still need to tell you what I couldn't say then. I ran away, not just from my life, but from myself. I hid behind a uniform, a fake name, because I was tired of being loved for what was on display. But then you showed up, and everything changed. I should have told you, I should have been brave, but for the first time I was being seen, not as a Prescott, not as an heir, but as a man. And I was afraid, a selfish fear of losing that. The truth is, I have nothing to ask of you. I just wanted to thank you for making me feel for a few weeks that I was someone beyond the lie. You were the place where my silence stopped hurting. Julian. When she finished reading, Cora sat perfectly still. The text was raw. There was no attempt to manipulate, no hollow phrases, just a man stripped of his arguments, speaking his pain with honesty. She didn't cry, but for the first time, she let the resentment soften at the edges. Not quite forgiveness, but doubt. What if he was telling the truth now? The sound of footsteps behind her broke her trance. It was Leo, his apron stained with paint. "Are you okay, Mom?" She looked at him as if just then returning to the real world. "I'm fine. Just reading some old things." She didn't mention Julian or the letter. But that night, instead of turning off the studio lights and going to bed early, Cora opened the box of patterns she had put away when he left. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to sketch. Not a dress, not a cape, but a jacket with firm lines, a straight cut, and a detail on the cuff. A small, invisibly stitched letter J. Meanwhile, Julian spent his days trying not to think about her, and failing. He had returned to the city, yes, but not to his old life. He ignored the meetings, the emails, the invitations. He spent his mornings walking aimlessly, his eyes always searching for something he couldn't name. It was on one of these walks that he wandered into an old fabric shop in the historic district. The owner, an elderly woman, greeted him with a gentle smile. "Looking for anything in particular?" she asked. He hesitated. Raw cotton canvas, something with a sturdy texture. She brought him a bolt of fabric. Julian touched it and was immediately reminded of Cora's studio, of the box of patterns, the hand-stitching, and right then and there he decided he would make something with it. Not to impress her, not to redeem himself, but to honor what he had felt. He bought the fabric, took it home, and for the first time in years he took out his mother's sewing machine, stored on the highest shelf in the laundry room. He couldn't sew like he used to. The thread kept slipping, the bobbin jammed, but he persisted. He made dozens of mistakes, and when he finally managed to finish a piece, simple, imperfect, with crooked stitches, he smiled. It was a man's jacket, raw canvas with a soft lining and a small hand-sewn pocket on the inside where he stitched in a tiny scrap of the letter he had written. It was no masterpiece, but it was real, and sometimes, Julian thought, real is enough. That week, Cora woke up earlier than usual. Her face was still marked by fatigue, but her eyes were no longer so dull. Instead of her usual work apron, she chose an old shirt of her father's, tied at the waist, and put on a necklace she hadn't worn in years. A gift from her mother, made of blue beads she claimed would protect against repeated heartaches. She sat at her sewing machine, but this time there were no orders, no deadlines. She sewed for herself, stitch by stitch. A simple piece, a long skirt, lightweight fabric. On the inner waistband, she embroidered the words, "Still here." She wanted to remember that every time she wore it, that despite everything, she was still herself. Meanwhile, Leo watched from a distance. The boy, who had always seen her as an unbreakable force, now noticed the fragility in her movements, but also a kind of rebirth. Cora was quieter, yes, but she had started smiling to herself again, and that was new. Late in the afternoon, she went out for a walk. The neighbors greeted her with subtle nods, some still cautious. The story with Julian had spread, or at least parts of it, but no one dared to comment. It was as if they all knew that some pains deserved to be surrounded by silence. She stopped in front of the old bus stop where, months before, Julian used to wait for his deliveries. The bench was still there, the same crooked backrest, the same peeling paint. She sat down, felt the wind on her face, and for the first time she didn't think about how it all could have been different. She just thought, what now? On the other side of the country, Julian was also waking up, not with promises of change or self-help speeches, but with small actions. In the days after sending the letter, he began sketching new ideas, but not for his brand. They were designs for affordable clothes, made from simple materials. He contacted a non-profit that supported independent seamstresses in low-income neighborhoods. He offered to mentor them without using his last name. He just said, "I want to help with what I know." He was turned down twice. Suspicion is the defense of those who have been ignored, but on the third try, someone really listened. Julian started visiting the community center on Wednesdays. He brought coffee, donated fabrics, sketched out patterns with the seamstresses, and listened to their stories. He didn't give orders, he asked questions. He pointed out solutions, but let them choose their own path. He was learning to exist without control. And there, surrounded by crooked stitches and old machines, he felt he had returned to something life had taken from him too soon: purpose. One rainy afternoon, one of the oldest seamstresses, a woman named Martha, told him, "You have the hands of someone who's made a lot of mistakes, and that's why you learn to be gentle." He smiled, because she was right. The visits to the center became his routine, and Julian, without realizing it, started to smile more than he used to. He no longer avoided mirrors. He no longer answered emails from the company with guilt. He answered because he wanted to, with boundaries. He rejected the multi-million-dollar influencer campaign. He proposed a new one, telling the real stories of invisible seamstresses. The board was skeptical. His father ignored him, but he stuck to his idea. He created a pilot collection of simple clothes, inspired by the women he'd met. The tags featured short phrases embroidered by anonymous hands. On one, he read, "We know how to stitch futures too." On her side, Cora continued her own inward journey. She didn't look for news about Julian, but she didn't stop herself from remembering either. She kept his letter inside an old book of her mother's, Love in the Time of Thread, a collection of stories about women who sewed to survive. She reconnected with some old clients, but she turned down large new orders. She wanted time, space. She began teaching Leo with more patience. She let him make mistakes with his stitches, let him cut the patterns crookedly, and she'd say with a smile, "The only ones who get it right are the ones who first accept they're going to get it wrong." She didn't know it, but she was talking about herself. One Saturday, Cora received a package from the city. A simple box, no return address. Inside was a jacket, raw canvas, handmade finish. On the lining, a small pocket with something embroidered on it. The letter J. She reached into the pocket. There she found a patch stitched with a phrase she already knew. "You were the place where my silence stopped hurting." She sat on the floor, the jacket in her lap. She didn't know what to think, or if this was a new beginning, but she didn't feel anger either. In that moment, she felt only this. He was trying, on his own, far from her, without promising anything. And maybe that in itself was a start. Julian woke up with the unsettling feeling that something had to be done. Not another letter, not another hidden or symbolic gesture. It was time to expose himself, for real, like never before. No script, no PR team, no emotional armor. He no longer wanted to control the narrative. He just wanted to tell it for the first time. He went to the community center workshop and asked Martha and the other seamstresses for a chat. They were sitting around the old cutting table, drinking coffee and eating day-old bread. He stood up, his eyes steady, his breath slow. "I need to ask for a favor," he began. "But only if you think it makes sense." They listened, and in the end, Martha was the first to speak. "If it's to show what we really go through, we'll help you. But you have to be the one out front, son, without hiding your name, without faking humility." Julian nodded. That was exactly what he wanted. 2 weeks later, an event was announced on a local social media page. The People's Runway, real stitches, real people. There were no luxury brands, no magazine sponsorships. The runway would be set up in the main square of the coastal town where it all began. A seaside village where Julian had been invisible for months. Now he would return as himself and accept whatever came his way. The day before the event, he arrived alone. No team, no professional photographer. He slept in the same boarding house where he had once been just Jules. Mrs. Gable received him with a neutral expression, but with a look in her eyes that didn't judge. It just observed. She showed him to the same room as before and said, "If you're coming back, you better do it with clean feet and a clear head." He smiled, grateful. He knew that here, every gesture was worth 1,000 words. The next morning dawned hot, with a salty wind blowing in from the sea. The town square was transformed. Instead of corporate banners, there were colorful fabrics hanging from the lampposts, each one sewn by one of the women from the project. The models, teenagers from the town, the seamstresses themselves, elderly women, children, all wearing clothes made from scraps, leftovers, and stories. No loud music, no celebrities. When Julian stepped onto the small improvised stage, a few faces recognized him. Others were just waiting for something different. He held a simple microphone, his hands trembling slightly. He took a deep breath. "Good afternoon, everyone." The sound carried lightly across the square. "Some of you might know me as Jules, others as Julian Prescott." Murmurs, a subtle shift in the crowd. "For months I lived in this town in hiding, pretending to be someone simpler, afraid of being loved for what I represent, and not for who I am." A pause. "I was dishonest, especially to one person who showed me what truth really means. And I'm not here to make a public apology. That would be too easy. I'm here to undress, not my clothes, but the character." He looked around. He knew Cora might be there, or she might not, but he continued. "I grew up surrounded by luxury, but I never felt like I belonged. My mother taught me how to sew, and life took it upon itself to teach me how to sew lies, until a woman showed me that what you stitch with truth lasts, even when it hurts." He picked up a hanger beside him. It was the jacket he had sewn. It was wrinkled, worn, but clean. Alive. This piece was made by me, with hands that learned how to make mistakes. It's imperfect, and that's exactly how I feel. But even though it's imperfect, it exists, and so do I. The square was silent. Children sat on the ground. Old-timers leaned against trees. Some people were filming. Others just listened. "Today, Prescott, yes, my family's brand, will be launching a clothing line made by real seamstresses. Each piece will tell the story of the person who made it. Each sale will support a community project like this one. We're not going to use famous faces. We're going to use people, real people." More murmurs. A young woman applauded, then another, and soon the square began to react. Not with cheers, but with the kind of applause that comes from understanding, not from spectacle. Julian stepped down from the stage. The event continued. The kids walked the runway. The clothes were enchanting. The older women smiled, seeing their work praised by people who, before, had ignored them. He sat on the edge of the square, exhausted, empty, but light. He felt that, for the first time, he didn't owe anyone anything. Not an explanation, not an image, just his presence. And then, in the middle of the crowd, between the colors and the voices, he saw someone standing near the juice stand. It was her, Cora. She was wearing the long skirt she had made for herself. She was alone, not smiling, but her expression, it wasn't the same. There was no anger, no forgiveness, just recognition. She approached slowly. He stood up, his heart racing, but without expectation, only with respect. "You said you wanted to show yourself," she began, her voice calm. "And you did," he swallowed hard. "I'm not expecting anything." "I know," she replied, "and maybe because of that, something has changed." They stood there, facing each other. He didn't touch her, didn't plead. She didn't declare anything, didn't promise a thing. But before she walked away, she said, "The jacket." It fit, but it wasn't the size that mattered. It was the gesture, and she left. Not like someone turning their back, but like someone leaving the door ajar. The morning after the show, the town woke up different. Not because of the lights or the event itself, but because of something more subtle. The conversations. In the cafes, the bakeries, on the sidewalks in front of houses, Julian's name came up between sips of coffee and sighs. But this time, not with contempt. "He spoke beautifully, didn't he?" murmured Mrs. Alice, a seamstress with trembling hands, as she delivered bread at the market. "And he seemed sincere," the baker replied, frowning. "I've never seen a rich man tremble like that holding a microphone." At the community center where the seamstresses worked, the atmosphere was buzzing. Photos from the event were starting to go viral online. One video, Julian's speech with the silent crowd, had taken off. Thousands of views in less than 24 hours. Comments poured in from all over the country. "I've never cried watching someone talk about sewing. This guy is for real. I want to buy clothes with a soul." In the city, corporate emails were exploding. The team at Prescott was split between shock and admiration. Some executives scrambled for damage control, while others suggested a new strategy. But a younger part of the team, the ones tired of empty campaigns, spoke up. This is what the brand needed: a face with honesty, a project with purpose. For the first time, this feels human. Julian's father, Anthony Prescott, watched the broadcast without saying a word. He didn't call, he didn't text, but he didn't reprimand him either. He just sat in his office, surrounded by gilded frames, and stared at an old photograph, Julian as a child, next to his mother, sewing a piece of blue fabric. Maybe it was time to rethink the legacy, but the world doesn't change with speeches alone. And Julian knew that. So he went back to the town, not with a party, but with quiet purpose. He returned to continue what he started. He organized new workshops. He created scholarships for young apprentices. He implemented a profit-sharing system between the brand and the seamstresses. With every sale, a percentage went directly into the hands of the person who did the sewing. It was a small amount at first, but it was fair. It was real. The people who once avoided him now approached him slowly. A nod here, a good morning there. The kids started calling him the Jacket Man, and gradually he stopped being an outsider. But the thing that still affected him the most was Cora's silence. She remained in town. She worked, she sewed, she taught Leo with more patience than before. The skirt she wore to the show became a wardrobe staple, always paired with light blouses and her hair tied up high. She walked with a lightness, as if she no longer carried the weight of disappointment, but still kept her distance. She didn't run from him, but she didn't get closer either. Until one random afternoon, everything changed. He was sitting under the shade of a cashew tree, sketching ideas for the next project, when he heard soft footsteps on the gravel. He looked up. It was Cora. She was wearing jeans, sandals, and carrying a fabric-wrapped parcel. "I have a delivery," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes steady. He stood up, confused. "For me?" She nodded and held out the package. It was light, square. When he opened it, he saw a white linen shirt with wooden buttons and a tiny embroidery on the collar, a question mark. "It's to remind you to keep asking questions. Always," she said. He smiled, his eyes misting over. "I'm still asking myself if I'll ever have the right to try again with you." Cora crossed her arms, thoughtful. She looked toward the horizon, where the sea was beginning to swallow the sun. "Trying isn't a right, it's a choice. You're already trying, and I'm watching." Silence. "And can I ask," he said, swallowing his insecurity, "do I still have a chance?" She met his gaze, unafraid, the way she faced every piece of fabric she had to tear apart to remake from scratch. "You have truth now, and that's more than most people have." She turned to leave, but before taking a step, she murmured, "But for now, take it slow. You're sewing on the inside now." And she was gone. Julian stood there, shirt in hand. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't love, but it was the beginning of a new kind of respect. The next day, he wore the shirt to a meeting with the brand's new partners. He refused the Italian suits, the last-minute stylists. He showed up as himself. The investors were surprised, but no one questioned it. There was something in Julian's eyes you couldn't find in a catalogue: wholeness. On his way out, a young intern approached him and said, "I saw your video. My mom's a seamstress. Thank you for giving her a voice." Julian shook his hand and said, "Tell her there's a lot more good stuff coming." And when he returned to the town that night, walking with his shoes in his hand and the breeze on his face, he felt something new, not relief, not happiness, but belonging. Because finally the world didn't recognize him for what he was hiding, but for what he had dared to show. And that was priceless. Julian learned that truth doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It doesn't explode. It seeps in, slowly, through the cracks. First it scares you, then it heals. For a long time he believed he had to be perfect to be loved, perfect to be accepted. He grew up hearing that failure was weakness, that vulnerability was a luxury for ordinary people. That's why he hid. That's why he lied. But what Cora showed him, without making any promises, was that no one has to hide their pain to be worthy of affection. In fact, it's the opposite. Real love isn't scared of the cracks. It looks inside them, and if it can, it sits there for a while. That's what changed Julian, not the loss, not the scandal, but the silence between them. That space where he had to look at himself, without excuses, without applause, and where he finally understood. His biggest mistake wasn't pretending. It was believing his real self wasn't enough. Cora learned too. She, who had spent her life being discarded, mended, stitched up inside and out. Who believed that people like her were only loved when they became useful, beautiful, cared for. She understood that trust isn't given, it's built. And that even though the world had taught her to be wary, you also have to leave a few cracks open. Because sometimes what gets in isn't a threat. It's light. Their story didn't become a fairy tale. There was no on-one-knee proposal, no final kiss in the rain. But it had something bigger: truth. And truth, when cultivated with care, becomes a home. They didn't promise each other forever. They promised presence. And that's what sustained their new beginning. Julian started spending time in the town not as an exception, but as a routine. Not to be seen, but to be there. To listen. To build with his hands and with time. Cora, in turn, started creating for herself again. She accepted that she didn't have to protect herself all the time, that even after being deceived, she could choose to love with more awareness and less fear. The lesson they both learned and left as their legacy was simple but brave. Being seen is scary, but being invisible, even when you're surrounded by people, is even scarier. And sometimes the greatest proof of love isn't staying. It's letting the other person show their whole self, even if it takes time, even if it hurts. Because loving someone for real begins with the permission to be who you are. No masks, no filters, just skin and courage. Time passed, but not quickly. No true story happens all at once. The changes didn't come in waves. They were more like tides, subtle, constant, discreet. Julian continued to live between two worlds. The big city was still his home base, but it no longer defined him. He spent half the week in the capital, managing Prescott with a new, more diverse and humane board, and the other days in the coastal town, where he kept his feet on the ground and his eyes on the details he'd learned to value. The brand changed. It moved out of glass storefronts and into communities. The campaigns stopped using airbrushed faces and started telling real stories of seamstresses, embroiderers, women who had never been seen before. The jacket he made became a symbol. It was never sold. It was displayed in the creative center as a reminder of imperfection, of new beginnings, of the courage to show your own internal stitches. Cora, for her part, never closed her doors to the world again, but she didn't throw them wide open either. She remained firm in her choice to protect her own peace. She started a creative sewing class for local teenagers. Teaching them what no one had taught her became her mission. Leo, her apprentice, now 17, became her right-hand man in the studio. He designed his first capsule collection with pride, pieces embroidered with phrases he'd heard from Cora while learning to sew. One of them, stitched in red on the pocket of a white blouse, read, "The courage to continue comes from what we feel, not from what others expect." As for Julian and Cora, they didn't get married, at least not on paper. They didn't post declarations of love. They didn't share anniversary photos, but they were together in their own way. They had coffee together on Sundays. They sewed side by side in comfortable silence. Sometimes they bickered over silly things. He about his perfectionism, she about the hurried pace he still carried within him. But they always forgave each other. With kindness. With time, the town learned to see them as a natural part of the landscape. They were no longer the couple from the scandal. They were just two adults who made mistakes, who tried, who persisted. And the most beautiful part, no one needed to know everything. They didn't share every detail of what they'd been through, but they didn't hide it either. It was all visible, yet discreet. Like an invisible stitch in a seam. You know it's there, holding things together, even if you can't see it. What happened next was this. They continued, not as a hero and a heroine, but as two real human beings. If this story touched you in some way, leave a like. It's your way of saying, I feel that too. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I really do read everything. And I love responding to those who share a small piece of their lives here. If you believe that real, imperfect stories still have a place in this world, hit subscribe. This channel is for you. And before you go, choose one of the two stories appearing on your screen now. I'll see you in the next video, where the emotions are still stitched with truth.